So good evening. A very, very good evening to you this Sunday evening. My name's Helen Avery and I'm here with you on Slooh for Constellation Stories. We're here every Sunday, or I'm here every Sunday at 9 p.m. And to start, if you're on the space situation page, or you're with me, then I'm just going to suggest switching over to Chile. You just click on the tab Chile wide field underneath. Let's see what's going on. And I say this because the Canary Islands are down tonight because of weather and ice. And we have Chile for like 15 minutes. That's all we get for Chile for this constellation this evening, which is Monoceros, the unicorn. And I don't want to waste a moment with that. So just urge you to click onto that Chile wide field, or even the Chile ultra wide field, as we try and work out. This is supposed to be the Seagull Nebula. And we'll just see if that is indeed working for us. Let's have a look. Yeah, it's IC 2177. Not seeing much nebulosity at the moment, I have to say, but there we are. We're on the Seagull Nebula. Hopefully I'll put in the right coordinates. Okay, so if you're wondering where we are, where is this Monoceros? It's a very faint constellation that we don't often see unless we're in a very dark area, so people tend to not have heard of it. In fact, I know I was talking about it a bit on Twitter this week, and people were like, I'm not sure this even exists, this unicorn in the sky. But it does. Because we are going to struggle a bit this evening not having the images, I have got a bunch of other images that I'm going to be showing on the Space Situation Room on the Livecast page and on the YouTube page to sort of keep us occupied. And the way I thought we'd do it is I'm going to share a few stories, and then towards the end we'll go through some member photos, a bit like we did last week, and just see what kind of objects we would have seen, what we would have won if the weather was good and we could see this constellation in Chile from 9 through 10. So I thought we'd do that. And as always, on the discussion board, I've put what the schedule was for tonight, all the objects we would have seen, and suggested missions beyond those. So if you're interested in Monoceros, you can just click on that. I think it's one of the most recent threads, and you'll be able to jump on that thread and you'll see, and I've laid out very clearly all the coordinates to help you just plug them in. So when you go to book a telescope, you can just use browse catalogue and just look for everything I've said in there, like NGC something or M something or IC something, and book them yourself. So I know it's good to sort of really sort of embed these constellations into us. One way of doing that is 1, hearing the stories, 2, seeing them with our own eyes, and 3, kind of getting to know them by booking them ourselves, or if you don't want to use Slooh, you can just find them with your binoculars, so just guiding yourself around like that. So I'm a bit disappointed we're not seeing much nebulosity. I don't know what's happened here, especially to start with. I was hoping for some wide clouds and things like that. So the Seagull Nebula, and I'm going to show you an image of it in a second, but I just don't want to ruin it, sort of compare the two until we're fully sort of developed on this page. It's so cool because it looks like a seagull, and it stretches over Canis Major and Monoceros. So I thought, let's just start with looking at where in the sky Monoceros is. So I'm gonna there we go, look at that. So here you can see, hopefully, I don't know if there's a bit of a time delay, but you can see the unicorn that is Monoceros, that's there on the left, with Canis Minor perched on its back. And then if we look on this right image, you get a better sense of it from, what you would see through binoculars or looking upwards at night. So you can see Canis Major with Procyon, that big star, is just above it. And then Canis sorry, Canis Minor, and Canis Major is just below it with Sirius, an enormous star. And then we're just to the left of Orion. So a really easy place in the sky to locate, but say a bit trickier to find the stars of Monoceros because it is so faint. But with binoculars you can catch some of these objects, we'll talk a bit about the Cone Nebula and Christmas Tree Cluster later, the Rosette Nebula, which is stunning, and I think even M50, which is this cluster we'll see in a moment, hopefully. I don't know, or better off tonight. We'll be able to, you should be able to see that perhaps with some binoculars. So say easy to find. And I know I've mentioned this before, but sadly, because of the timing of this, our time together, 9 to 10, we're not going to get to do Canis Major until next, until like many months, and maybe like November or something. So sadly, we're going to miss that. But that is where it would be in the sky at night. So I just want to check back on Chile to see if we can see any nebulosity. I'm not sure what I've done there, so it could be just because it's just so enormous. In fact, what I'm going to show you before we get going with these stories is how wonderfully enormous it is. Now let's see, bear with me, just blank the screen for a moment. Okay, so isn't that beautiful? That is the Seagull Nebula. So you can see its head, to me it looks a bit more like a pterodactyl, to be honest. We'll keep, oh, wrong one, we'll keep that up. So we can just remind ourselves what we're looking at. So there, here's the Seagull Nebula. That's its head and its outstretched wings. And let's see, yeah, there's a different view of it. So here you can kind of see its head and its wings. It's the Seagull Nebula, and then up about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, that's M50, which is going to be up next on Chile, this open heart cluster. And then you can sort of see that Canis Major is just kind of to the right. And then I think I might show you what might be useful also, which I wasn't planning to, but I think it would be useful. Is this pirate's treasure image. Okay, so here you can see, and I think this is useful because you can see this line across the middle of the page, horizontal line, depicts where Canis Major starts and Monoceros starts. It's like the border of Monoceros and Canis Major. And the Seagull Nebula, you can see, is predominantly Monoceros, but there is a little bit coming down into Canis Major, and its head, if you can sort of make it out, is on the right, and then yeah, sort of these vague wingspan. And Stephen James O'Meara calls this kind of pirate's paradise, all these things in here, which we may get a chance to talk about, but we may not, because we've got a lot on our agenda today. So let's just pop back to where is Monoceros. Fantastic. And if you are looking at the Seagull Nebula, let me just tell you a couple of things about it. So it was discovered by a Welsh astronomer, actually, Isaac Roberts, and it contains a couple of open clusters. That pirate's paradise I mentioned, actually Lewis B caught a couple of those this week using the Slooh telescopes, and I believe I put those on the thread as well if you wanted to take a look. And it's an H2 region, which means it's a region of sort of interstellar atomic hydrogen that's ionized, which sounds very fancy, but if you remember the Orion Nebula we looked at a couple of weeks ago, that was an H2 region too. As I mentioned, up next in a minute, we're going to be looking at the open cluster, the M50. In fact, we're coming to it now. So this cluster is 78 million years old. And it's about 3,200 light years away. So you can sort of imagine, you know, the light coming in now to this telescope as we're taking a look at it. And it's thought Cassini discovered this first in about 1711, but it's actually Messier who gets credit for this one. So it's M50, as I mentioned. And apparently he sort of noticed it while observing a comet. And we think there's about 200 stars in this. It's definitely more than 100. And then one big red star, it's an M giant. I'm not sure we'll get the colour on Chile, to be honest, but and I find it hard to see the heart shape, but I'm going to point you to Carol Botha's. She posted something in Illuminations with like a sketch of M50, and you can very clearly see the outline of a heart. So yeah, definitely go and have a look at that. And in fact, I think if you're in the Space Situation Room, there'll be if you kind of scroll down under it, there'll be an Illuminations in DIY, and you'll see Carol's there. I think it's called The Heart of a Unicorn. It's a really lovely post as well about her sort of observations in Monoceros, so highly recommend it. Okay, but we're here for some stories. and I'm sure, you know, I was so excited about this being a unicorn, and it gets everyone's imagination going. And I just want to share that I posted earlier today. I don't know if you're on Twitter. I'm kind of newbie to Twitter myself, so don't worry if you're not. You're not missing it all. But I put up a poll just to say, do you believe unicorns ever existed? And we've got 66 votes, and 2/3 say no way, and 1/3 say yes, they do. And a couple of people have sort of messaged me and said, well, I don't believe they're like the horse with the horn, but I do believe that something existed that inspired this myth of the unicorn. So we're going to be talking about unicorns, but I first wanted to talk about the gentleman who named this, because I really was fascinated. I thought, you know, it's pretty bold. He lived in the 1600s, this gentleman. It's pretty bold in the 1600s that when you're naming a constellation, you call it a unicorn. You know, if you want some sort of credibility as an astronomer, it seems kind of odd that you would call a star or a constellation something of a mystical animal. So I thought I started sort of poking around to find out a little bit more about him. And he's a really fascinating character. In fact, I kind of want to give up everything and go and write a book about him because I couldn't find any books on him. So his name's Petrus Plancius, and I wanted to share with you his story because for me it is absolutely fascinating and really rich. So I'm going to be just putting up some images. We've got 3 minutes left on the open cluster, so please enjoy that. But I was going to just put up a couple of pickies while we're here. I'm going to move this one so it's always with us, so you can kind of always see it like so. And there he is. That's Petrus Plancius. That's who we're going to be talking about. So he was actually born as Pieter Platevoet in West Flanders in the late 1500s. And he studied theology in Germany and England. So he was quite sort of, you know, well-travelled. And at the age of 24, he became a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. But fearing religious prosecution by the Inquisition, he flees from Brussels to Amsterdam after the city falls into Spanish hands in 1585. And when he arrives in Amsterdam, he becomes really interested in navigation and cartography. And being fortunate enough to have access to some nautical charts that he's recently found from Portugal, he's soon recognised as like an expert on the shipping routes to India. So if you don't know, this is and sort of interesting, you know, here we are talking about astronomy, but this was the age of exploration of the globe. Sort of from the 1400s, you know, with Columbus, all the way up to the end of the 1700s. It was this time when boats were setting sail from all over Europe in search of new lands, new trade routes, and new colonies. And sort of like an era of like great advancement and technology, but also, as we know, an era of like a lot of the worst of humankind, to be honest. A lot of slave trade and mistreatment of the colonies and greed over this sort of race for these new trade routes. So, but very interesting in terms of like mapping the world out. Now, Portugal at this time is kind of the king of these trade routes. So he's lucky to have our Mr. Flatfoot, Petrus Plancius. He's lucky to have this map, and the Portuguese and Spanish, they've been largely winning this race. And I kind of think of it as, you know, we had the space race. Well, this was like the equivalent, only the voyages weren't skywards, they were across oceans. So it's been 100 years since Columbus has come to the Americas, for example, and now much of Antwerp's business in Belgium has moved over to Hamburg in Germany. So the Spanish and Portuguese have like cut the Dutch and Belgians out of the equation, and it's become a bit really competitive in Europe now. And so the Dutch are considering a revolt. And what they need is cartographers and explorers and those who are going to fund their work. So for our man Plancius, this is a boon. Like, he has arrived in Holland at the right time. And seemingly he's more interested in mapping the sea, more interested in sort of mapping the skies than the seas. He becomes part of the first Dutch voyage to the East Indies that leaves the port of Texel in April 1595. And it's headed, the East Indies were Malaysia, Indonesia, parts of Asia that were under the influence of India. And this is kind of our first clue, perhaps, to Plancius's interest in the unicorn. We'll discover whether he thought it was real. So rather than board the vessel, the Hollandia, Plancius instead asks one of his students, Pieter Keizer, who's the chief navigator, to map the skies in the southern hemisphere for him, which were largely uncharted at the time. So this gentleman, Petrus Plancius, I don't know if you know this, and we'll talk about this, but he actually named many constellations, in particular the southern constellations. But this voyage, which brought that about, was doomed. So by the time this fleet, it's a fleet of 4 that leave Texel, by the time they are finally able to obtain fresh supplies in Madagascar in September, 71 of the 248 sailors have died, mostly of scurvy. And the surviving crew stay for several months on the island to recover and make repairs and stuff, at which point Plancius's student, the navigator Keizer, probably made most of his celestial observations. But it took another 4 months then to reach Java in Indonesia, and trade negotiations had really soured, probably blocked by the Portuguese. So what happened was those on board ended up running out of drinking water, they fell ill, and finally when the ship returned over 2 years later, only 81 made it back, and Keizer was not one of them. He died on that trip. But Plancius did receive Keizer's notes, and from the observations of the expedition, he created a celestial globe later that year that showed 12 new constellations of the southern sky, have been accepted among the standard constellations. And that's often credited to Johann Bayer, but it's not. It was Petrus Plancius. And if we're sort of more honest, it was really Keizer who should have been credited for it. To the majority, Petrus Plancius, however, he names them. And he names them after animals. So it's beginning to be a bit of a clue here into what he was like. He names them after animals that 16th century explorers had encountered. So I don't know if you're familiar with the southern constellations, but there's the ones he named were chameleon, toucan, bird of paradise, swordfish, I think there's a water snake, a peacock, the flying fish. Did I say that one? So kind of names constellation based on observations. So I'm just beginning to sow a bit of a seed, whether the unicorn was real or not. But he's yet to name our Monoceros, because that's going to come in a little bit. So I just wanted to show you a map. So you can Google Petrus Plancius, and he has some really, really beautiful maps of the globe and also of the skies. Let's see if we can see this one. Oh dear, moving all this about. Okay, maybe it's best if I just move this one. There we go. Here is one of his maps. It's just, you know, it's not like maps today. It's so beautiful, and this lovely sailing ship we can see. So, you know, here is, you know, he names these, I think in about 1595, he names the southern constellations, or when they get back, so it may be 1596. And then several years passes, and now Petrus is really making something of a name for himself, and he co-founds the Dutch East India Company in 1602. So I'm just going to get rid of this map and bring our man back up. There we go. There we go. So we can sort of set our eyes on him. Doesn't look very happy, does it? I feel like all men in this era looked like this at a certain age. I don't know if you do. But anyway, he co-founds the Dutch East India Company, and its purpose is trade, exploration, and colonization. And it sort of pays for sailing ships to be sent out for this reason, to look for trade, to explore new places, and to look for places to colonize. So it becomes part of, you know, funded by the government as well. It's very, very powerful. Ends up becoming a monopoly of the Dutch spice trade as well. I mean, the Dutch have it down. Like, they completely kick the Portuguese away and become like the rulers of the seas and of trade in the early 1600s. So the Dutch East India Company is like it's the first ever listed company. And in its heyday is the most valuable corporation ever to have existed. It's unbelievable. Probably not in Plancius's lifetime. It had a 200-year lifespan, this company. But certainly was extremely, extremely powerful. I mean, over its lifespan, it sends almost 1 million Europeans to work in the Asia trade on almost 5,000 ships. And so arguably at this moment, as I say, the Dutch are kind of the rulers of the sea. And this gentleman here who named our constellation is part of that. So what would help the Dutch get richer quicker? In these days of sort of trade and the like equivalent of the space race, and that would be a shorter route to China. And Plancius, our boy Plancius, believes there is one through the Arctic. It's called the Northern Passage, and here is his connection to another wonderful explorer, Henry Hudson. So Henry Hudson, the English sea explorer and navigator, also believes in this Northern Passage. And it's this passage that's supposed to go through the Arctic to China. And it's a bit of a unicorn itself, this passage, because, you know, no one knows anyone who's ever done it, but everyone's got a story about it and people believe it exists. But no one's ever seen this passage with their own eyes. But Plancius believes it exists, and Henry Hudson believes it exists. And Plancius has this like harebrained theory that as the North Pole is in daylight for 3 months of the year, the ice will melt and this magical passage will open up over the summer season in the Northern Hemisphere. And Hudson buys it. And so do the English, because in 1607, an English trading company hire Hudson on his first recorded voyage ever, and in May he sets off east on the ageing vessel the Hopewell with a crew of 10, just 10, in search of this passage past sort of Greenland and the tops of Canada. And by the by, this is the year that the English colony of Jamestown, Virginia is founded by John Smith. But by June, Hudson's passage is already thwarted because of ice, but it's not entirely fruitless because he discovers several islands and bays and finds a large amount of whales and comes back and reports on that. So he returns to England, obviously not being able to find this Northern Passage, and is now obsessed with this passage, absolutely obsessed. And despite being sort of Britain wants to send him out to look for whaling opportunities because the whaling industry is about to take off. He says no, Hudson, he just wants to find this passage. The following year, 1608, he's sent out again. This time he goes northwest through Russia. But again, ice blocks his path and he's forced to return home. And now, sort of giving up on this northern passage, they're not wasting any more money. The English refuse to fund any more of these voyages. And so, what is effectively treason, Hudson heads to Holland and he seeks out Petrus Plancius and his friends at the Dutch East India Company. And the story goes that Plancius and Hudson spend many months together debating whether the Northeast Passage or the Northwest Passage were more favourable. I mean, both are myths, but these two gentlemen are still discussing which of their beliefs is right. And Plancius favours the former. He thinks that going east through Russia is a safer bet than going west around Canada and up that way. But in this process, they become really close friends. And Hudson draws freehand maps for his voyages for Plancius to keep. And Plancius finds Hudson a voyage for the Dutch East India Company and helps him work out possible routes to find this northern passage. And since neither speak each other's language, apparently they converse in Latin. How amazing is this? So in 1609, Hudson sets sail for the Dutch East India Company on the vessel the Half Moon and heads northwest on Plancius's suggestion. But again, he heads northeast towards Russia. But again, he's sort of met with ice. So this time he turns his boat westwards and heads to North America. Now this is breaking contract and breaking the law. He's taking a Dutch vessel somewhere where he shouldn't be going. However, it's on this voyage that he sails into New York Harbour and up the Hudson River, which of course he's named after today. As you may know, I didn't know until I moved here 12 years ago, he arrives in Albany up the river and he can't go any further and has to turn back. So it's another kind of fruitless trip when it comes to the Northern Passage, but it's one that we have so many tales of Hudson's adventures with the native peoples he met here. But still a man possessed, in 1610 Hudson sets off once more in search of his and Plancius's Northern Passage, and it is to be his last. So let me just pull up a picture here of old Hudson. There he is. That will give you a clue as to the fate of Henry Hudson. So under a British flag this time, the ship Discovery sets sail in May 1610 and heads to Greenland on this northwest passage that Hudson's sort of putting his bets on. But already by July, the boat is slowed by ice, the men are plagued with sickness, and according to journals, the crew begin to be a bit troubled because Hudson starts acting a bit strange. By October, Hudson and his band have still failed to find this route, and instead Hudson's been dragging them up and down the coast in freezing weather, and tempers are beginning to fray, and mutiny is on the lips of every sailor. So after spending a month up and down what's now known as Hudson Bay, the crew start to get a little suspicious. Is Hudson surveying the land? Is he reporting on potential places for colonies for the Dutch? Is he trying to find places for whaling? What is he up to? Now, eventually, the crew are forced to jump onto land. They can no longer move. They're frozen in, and they ride out 6 months in freezing temperatures, waiting for the ice to melt so they can once again try and find this northwest passage. And several members of the crew die, and food is very scarce. And if tensions were high, they're now through the roof. They end up leaving in June 1611, and still Hudson is just sailing up and down James Bay, which is a really shallow body of water that seems obvious is not going to lead to a waterway. And so now the crew have had enough. And on June 22nd, they make their move. Hudson is rounded up with the 6 members of the crew, and totaling 9, they are put into a small boat. They are handed some pots, some pike, some meal and some clothes, and then the mutineers cut the rope that holds the boat to the ship, and they set sail. But Hudson and the sick men, knowing their fate in the freezing waters, you can see them here, in their small sort of dinghy boat, if you will, they row with all their might to try and pursue the ship, the Discovery, but they are no match for it. And the mutineers put up the Discovery's topsails and then the mainsails, and the ship sail away, leaving Hudson and these other 8 men in this little boat floating around in ice water, never to be seen again. Just fascinating that our guy Petrus Plancius has kind of a role in this. And it turns out that Plancius probably was right, that the northeast route was probably the route to take, although that still was not traversed until 1878. That was Niels Nordenskjöld of Sweden accomplished that. And this northwest passage that Hudson obsessed over and eventually killed him, really, was not crossed until 1903. So really unbelievable. But our story with Plancius is of course not over, because why we're all here is because of Monoceros, our unicorn. So 1 year after Hudson doesn't return, Plancius kind of now focuses his sights back on astronomy and celestial navigation. And in 1612, he introduces 8 constellations: the Bee, Cameleopardis, Cancer Minor, the Euphrates, the Cock, the River Jordan, the Southern Arrow, and of course, Monoceros. And of all of these, only Cameleopardalis and Monoceros are still found on modern star charts and recognised today. And Cameleopardis we are going to get to, I think, fairly soon. So I'm excited about that too. But we're here for Monoceros and our unicorn. And you know what I find really interesting here is even just listening to these constellations that he named that are no longer recognised, they're all very reasonable. You know, Cancer Minor, Euphrates, the Cock, River Jordan, Southern Arrow, the Bee. There's nothing mystical about these. But it feels like Monoceros and perhaps even Cameleopardalis, which is the giraffe and has sort of ties to sort of this mystical creature, not dissimilar to a unicorn really in parts of Asia. It feels like they were maybe, these two were kind of a nod to, here he is again, to his sort of earlier days of working with navigators around South Asia. And the reason I say this is because the first evidence, shall we say, of the existence of unicorns, or the belief in unicorns perhaps, comes in about 2000 BCE, so about 4,000 odd years ago, in South Asia. So the Indus Valley civilization happens to have these, they've discovered these ancient seals with what looks like a unicorn on them. So I'm going to show you one now and see what you think. Let me just get rid of our boy Plancius. Here we go. So this is from about 1700 BCE. In fact, there's some before that look just the same, 1900 BCE, of what we think is the earliest depiction of a unicorn. So I don't know if you want to compare that to this unicorn on the left. No, it doesn't look particularly mystical, does it? And it certainly doesn't, I mean, it doesn't look too dissimilar to what we see today, maybe, you know, without the hair. More of a snout, perhaps. It doesn't look like it's going to be leaping over things quite like our unicorn is on the left, but anyway. And in fact, it looks a bit like an aurochs. You know, we talked about this with Taurus. Was Taurus a bull, or was Taurus what sort of preceded the bull? This aurochs is a bit like this. And sort of interesting how we get sort of from here this particular unicorn from 4,000 odd years ago to this horse that we're more familiar with today, this very pretty pretty horse that young girls around the world love. And indeed, really, the depictions and descriptions of unicorns really vary over the next, from this 4,000 years, and are quite sort of far away, actually, from this cutesy little unicorn we think of today. In fact, sort of the 2,000 years after this seal, the unicorn is sort of thought to be, or even though 3,000 and a bit, really, it's nothing like this pretty little horse here. So the first writings we have about unicorns, possibly, like in terms of writings, possibly in the Bible. And there's a lot of opinion and discussion, actually, on whether various translations of this, the strong animal that's talked about in the book of Job, a few other books, it's sometimes referred to as the reem, sometimes translated as the reem, which was thought to be similar to an aurochs, but it was also translated as a unicorn in some versions. Some people say it's a mistake, some people don't. So possibly the first writings about the unicorn were in the Bible, and it was referred to as strong, which is not something we typically think about with our modern day version of a unicorn. Then we have the ancient Greeks come along. Now, the ancient Greeks didn't consider a unicorn as part of their myths. They sort of, their accounts of unicorns were in their natural history studies. They believed them to have lived in India. So kind of interesting that the Greeks, so well known for their myths, for them, we've sort of swapped. So for us, it's a myth, but for the Greeks, it was very much real, the unicorn. It did exist. And one of the earliest of these Greeks is a man whose name I'm not going to be able to pronounce. It's, I'm going to say Theseus. He was a physician and historian who, in one of his books, described them as wild asses, fleet of foot, having a horn, a cubit and a half in length, coloured white, red and black. And that was about 400 BCE. I'm just going to pull up a pic that's a bit more like... Here we go. Let's see if I can... Can I get him? Just move him over a bit. See if I can squeeze this down. There we go. It was a bit more like this, kind of a brutish looking animal from the descriptions. We have a gentleman called Strabo, who talks about like a horse head with a horned horse rather, with a stag-like head. It's a bit closer to what we have today. But then I wanted to read to you from this wonderful book, Traveller's Tales. I've read for you from this before. It was published in the late 1800s by a gentleman called Henry Hudson Adams. But he researched these sort of sightings of these creatures, of all sorts of mythical creatures. And Caesar, he says, described this animal, quadruped, the bulk of an ox, the figure of a deer, and from the middle of whose forehead a single horn stands out, higher than straighter than any horn known to him. Pliny the Elder, sort of sensible, believable gentleman, I think, says that this unicorn is a ferocious beast with the body of a horse, the head of a deer, the feet of an elephant, the tail of a wild boar, and a single black horn standing out of its forehead. So a bit more like this one we're looking at here. And of course, I don't know, you're probably saying, well, that's a rhino. And there is some sort of discussion about, well, were people referring to rhinos? And we don't know. We do not know. It's sort of there are so many different depictions of this unicorn. It's hard to just pin it and say, yeah, that absolutely would have been a rhino, especially the different coloured horns. But this is all very well. But do we have, these are just kind of, and this goes on and on over hundreds of years. Aristotle comments on it, not hundreds of years later, around the same time. Marco Polo talks about it, and then all these other researchers talk about what a unicorn looks like, and they kind of describe it as a bit like this. But no one's ever, it's always sort of piggybacking on, oh, this is what someone wrote in a book. No one actually says they've seen it with their own eyes until a gentleman named Peter Platevoet, who's an Italian historian, the service of Spain, again during this age of exploration in the 1500s. He says he sees one in Africa. He says, "The lands and desolate pastures of this region are inhabited and devoured of wild and terrible beasts. But there is one beast in which nature has endeavoured to show her cunning. This beast is as big as an ox, armed with a long snout like an elephant, is the colour of an ox, with the hoof of a horse, with ears like an elephant but not quite so open, and much wider than any other beast's ears." And it's, well, is that a unicorn? It sounds a bit odd. A couple of other people around the same time mentioned that they saw some. A gentleman called Ludovicus Velamanus says he sees two sent to the Sultan from Ethiopia and kept in a repository in Muhammad's tomb at Mecca. And then as time goes on, some of the depictions get a bit weirder because they start to talk about this creature as having a flexible horn. So a gentleman called Dr. Andrew Smith, who's an eminent South African zoologist, he cites, and again it's a bit like, he says and she said and this person said, he cites a missionary in Madagascar who says that one of the natives told him that there was a quadruped called the Nazu Dazu. How amazing is that? The Nazu Dazu. Which is by no means rare, and it's the size of a horse, extremely fleet and strong, a single horn projecting from its forehead, that is said to be flexible when the animal is asleep, curled up like an elephant's proboscis, but becomes very stiff under the excitement of rage. And it's an extremely fierce animal, invariably attacking a man whenever it discerns him. And then it talks about how the natives escape. They climb a tall tree. It's genius. And then wait for the animal to calm down, and then he runs away. And there's a few other discussions in sort of in the 1700s and 1800s of these sightings of this animal with just one horn that is impossible to be captured, but is extremely ferocious and has this really soft horn. How bizarre. One of the things I thought was kind of interesting about this was, again, like, we've not really got any concrete evidence. It is a bit, other than this Peter Martyr, who I'm not sure his depiction is really of a unicorn. There's nothing really to kind of show that there was true. I mean, even people point out that if you didn't see a unicorn in the Roman amphitheatres, can you really say they existed? Because all kinds of like menagerie were there. One legend has it that when Noah had to pack up the ark in the face of the flood, the unicorns were just too slow. So Noah just sort of kind of shut the door and left without them, and that's why we don't see any unicorns anymore. So that was kind of a cute legend. That maybe they did exist, but they never made it through the great flood. But as I say, in the Middle Ages, sort of from 500, the 6th century to 16th century, it was then that this kind of horse likeness that we have more today came out, and then it sort of got wiped out again by these real explorers in the age of exploration who were saying, no, I've seen a unicorn and it doesn't look like this horse with a lovely horn and a golden mane. It looks more like this kind of weirdy bull, elephant, rhino thing. But it's interesting how that came about. I don't know. If you know, I'd love to hear from you. Helen@slooh.com. I would love to know why we suddenly ended up with a horse with a golden mane. And a lot of pictures in the Middle Ages are of, sort of said that the unicorn represented purity and chastity. It was associated with Christianity. I don't know whether that's because of the translations in the Bible of unicorn, and they depicted unicorns could only be tamed by virgins, which is a bit bizarre that kind of emerged during that period. And that's kind of what we've held on to today, this idea of this very sort of angelic pure creature with this golden mane and this golden horn. So I was looking around at whether people still claim to see unicorns, and the last sighting I could find of a unicorn was in 2014. So just under 4 years ago, in fact, a gentleman claimed to have seen a unicorn roaming the Highland area near to Wick in Caithness, Scotland. And in fact, actually, the unicorn is not a stranger to Scotland. Let's see if I can show you this. Nope, wrong one. There we go. That is the Scottish royal coat of arms. You'll see the unicorn on the left and the lion on the right. So the unicorn was chosen actually on the Scottish sort of seal or flag because it was seen as being proud and haughty and would rather die than be captured. So interesting how it had this sort of reputation. And in fact, there were these golden coins in Scotland known as the unicorn and half unicorn that had a unicorn on them. And that was in the 15th and 16th century. So around the time of Petrus Plancius, this unicorn was still very much in the consciousness of people. It's very interesting. And what makes me giggle about this particular coat of arms that we're seeing is the English equivalent is slightly different. The unicorn is on the opposite side, and the lion is sort of a bit more prominent. So it's sort of funny to me that they're slightly different. They're like, well, my unicorn's bigger in this one because we're Scottish, and smaller in the English one because obviously they want to show their power instead. Sort of back to this sort of our gentleman in Scotland in 2014. So the newspaper reports say he was out hiking near to the castle of Old Wick when he spied what was described as a unicorn, saying it was, I can't do a Scottish accent, but basically a horse with a horn. I could ne'er believe it. And our gentleman didn't manage to get a photograph, but according to this newspaper, the locals say that his sighting was the talk of the town. And the unicorn didn't stay in sight for long and was last described as cantering off in the direction of Loch Hempriggs to the south of the town. And it said it was expected that the sighting would lure many people to Wick, many tourists to try and sight this magical creature of lore. But the gentleman who spied it, who wished to remain anonymous, did offer one piece of advice for those wanting to find this magical creature. And he said they shouldn't go looking for it. What kind of advice is that? It's terrible advice. He said that he believes it came to him precisely because he specifically wasn't searching for it, and therefore it was able to trust him. So there we go. Don't go looking for a unicorn, and you may just see one. But lucky us, we have one in the sky thanks to this wonderful gentleman, Petrus Plancius. Such a fascinating man. I just can't believe there isn't a book about him. And if you're inspired to write about him, I would love to, or you know anything about him, I'd love to hear more about his life. So it, by my watch, it's 9:48. So I wanted to, in our last sort of 15 minutes or so, delve into what unfortunately we weren't able to see this evening through our telescopes. So I wanted to start pulling up some images. So I'm just rustling around as I find my notes of what I wanted to show you. Let me just see if I can bring this up again. I think it was in this one. One of the things Monoceros is very well known for is the Rosette Nebula. As you can see here, that sort of appears to be in the face of the unicorn. It almost looks like his cute little eye, the Rosette Nebula. Oh, and it really is a stunner. So I do recommend that if you get a chance to book a mission to it, definitely do that. And I just wanted to show you a couple of pics. Right, wowzers. So Paul Cox very kindly posted this on the thread. This is a picture from, I'm assuming a Slooh member because it's got the Slooh watermark at the bottom, David Mihalek. or Mihalich perhaps, took this wonderful picture, and it really, you can see, looks just like a rose, or a rosette, like a little rose. So you can see this apparently with binoculars. I've not seen it. It's another H2 region, and this is about 5,000 light years away and about 130 light years in diameter. It is a whopper. And these stars in the middle are a cluster of their own, and they are formed, or they were formed, by the nebula's matter. So just lovely. And you can, it's normally 2244, NGC 2244, that actually I might have that wrong, it might be 2237. I've put it on the discussion thread that you look for, and then the cluster is, I think, 2244. So you can sort of dive in a bit into sort of the heart of the Rosette Nebula, and then zoom out a little bit and capture it in its entirety. Paul recommended that Canary 1 is a good one to see this. So that is a beauty, and I just wanted to share Mario's as well. This is he took recently. This is on our Slooh telescopes. I can't remember which telescope, sorry, he used for this one, but again, just stunning. I mean, really is such a, and the way those stars look around the edges, they almost appear sort of a greenish, like the leaves of a rose. So that's kind of primarily one of the big objects that Monoceros is known for. The other is, yeah, I want to do this one, is Hubble's Variable Nebula. Whoa, yep, there it is. This is courtesy of NASA, I believe. And I just wanted to read you what Lewis B wrote about this. I thought it was really fun. He mentioned, he sort of referred to it as like the bridal veil, and sometimes it's sort of upside down. And he said it reminds him of the veil thrown up in the air by a very happy, inebriated, partying new bride. So I thought that was kind of perfect. I can sort of imagine a bride doing that, throwing her veil up. But yes, this is Hubble's Variable Nebula, and it's super interesting. Paul Cox kind of mentioned, you know, how many times do you think this has been mistaken for a comet? It kind of looks that way. And that is sort of at the top, in the top left, that's a star. Obviously, it's R Monocerotis, or R Mon, and it's known. And this nebula is illuminated by that star, which isn't sort of directly visible itself. It's a reflection nebula. What else can I tell you? And oh yeah, the reason it's so interesting is it's a variable nebula. So this shot will look entirely different probably next week, and then the week after. So I was thinking one fun thing we could do with Slooh's telescopes is kind of track the variability of this nebula. You could set up a mission over a period of like 3 months, keep those pictures and compare them to show you the variability. So William Herschel actually discovered this in 1783, but Edwin Hubble gets its name because he studied the variability. Check anything about this. Oh, it's 2,500 light years away and is about 1 light year across. So sort of much smaller than our gigantic Rosette Nebula, but nonetheless really, really pretty. And Lewis wanted me to mention that he's kind of obsessed with this at the moment. And he took this picture earlier this week and was kind of sort of asking people what they thought some of the stuff around the nebula was. So if you want to hop on the discussion thread on Monoceros, if you're interested in that, or maybe talking to Lewis about tracking together the variable nebula, that might be kind of fun. Let's see, what do we want next? That's the kind of nice thing, if I can get to pick. I get to choose. So I think we'll do, here we go, yeah, okay. So this is the Cone Nebula with the Christmas tree cluster. which is another stunner that is in Monoceros. So we think, you know, these lesser known constellations, I'm so grateful that we get to go through them, because then we can really see like the, you know, the hidden gems in them. It's just unbelievable what's up there, and we sort of tend to stick to the same old constellations. So it's really lovely that we get to sort of explore these together. So the Cone Nebula, you can see the cone at the bottom, and that's a dark absorption nebula. Maybe it reminds you of the Rosette Nebula that we saw in Orion, and that's because they're very similar. They're very dense, so they obscure the light from behind it. There's a couple of other nebulae here. So up the top right, there's a bit of blur. That has a name of its own. Apparently that is the Foxfur Nebula. And then somewhere in the middle, and I can't quite work out where, it's something called the Snowflake Nebula. But typically we think of this whole thing as kind of the Cone Nebula, and, well, the Christmas tree cluster. And all these stars that we're seeing, supposedly in the shape of a Christmas tree. I guess that's because we're upside down. Yes, that's exactly it. So if you turned it upside down the other way, you would see what's more like a Christmas tree, which is interesting because William Herschel discovered this nebula the day after Christmas Day. So indeed it was kind of a Christmas theme. So there tend to be, the Cone Nebula and Christmas tree cluster tend to be thought of as together. Now, William Herschel, who discovered them, didn't see them as together. He saw the Christmas tree cluster as being separate to the Cone Nebula. But then they just kind of got listed by John Herschel as being like one and the same, and then that ended up being listed in the New General Catalogue as one and the same. But they actually weren't. Apparently Leland Copeland was the first to call it the Christmas tree cluster, actually. And this is, again, 2,600 light years from Earth. Awesome. And the star 15, Monoceros, is at the tree's base. So that, I'm assuming that bright star right at the top would be that star. And I did set a mission to see that, because apparently that's kind of a fun star to zoom in on close. Okay. So the other one I wanted to talk about was Avery's Island, but we don't have time. Not time to talk about my named island, but so many stories. But we'll save it for another day perhaps, or maybe I'll put up something in Illuminations. So I'm going to leave just up this Cone Nebula while I just have just talk a little bit about some of the other things you could see. So I mentioned Avery's Island. I've put that up in the discussion board as a suggested mission. There's a Butterfly Nebula as well, Lewis reminded me of earlier. That's a planetary nebula, and it's really beautiful, the shape of it, so recommend that. A couple of other stars and a couple of other clusters. I mentioned the Pirate's Treasure, I mentioned those are in there too. So I know we're battling with some weather and stuff this winter, although I gather we're very lucky that the telescopes have been open this week, which is phenomenal. But if you fancy setting up a mission to Monoceros, I know I'd love to piggyback on those. We're still trying to do our winter circle as well. Did a couple this week, but again, some of the missions didn't run. Managed to get Rigel last night. That looks really kind of bluey pink. It was really amazing. But I'm going to set up a few more missions this week to Sirius, Rigel again, Procyon. I think that's what we've got left. And I'm going to attempt to do Canis Minor next week. I'm going to look to see if that's possible. It sort of depends. I just really never know until about Tuesday, once I've tested out the telescopes for that day. But I think that's kind of my goal. But as always, I would love to hear your thoughts on the discussion board. You're always welcome to email me or tweet me any ideas you have. I know some people have made some recommendations, but they're just out of sight. Some of those 9 p.m. on a Sunday from Canary Islands, unfortunately. What have we got coming up? I know we can take Ursa Major in... when are we going to do that? at the end of March, beginning of March perhaps. We're going to take Ursa Major, so a really big one. We've still got Leo. We're working our way through the zodiac, one a month. So February's will be Leo, and we did Cancer last month. And on all this sort of talk of nebulae, just to let you know that Dr. Paige Godfrey's Intro to Astronomy on Wednesday is going to be about nebulae. So I really recommend getting that if you can, because there's so many different types. You know, we talked about a reflection, and then there's like the H2 region, and we have this like dark nebula, emission nebula. So it'd be great to sort of gen up on what those are. So yeah, when we talk about them on Sundays, we all know I'm going to be watching for sure. And Paul's back next Sunday to talk practical astronomy. So if you're having trouble figuring out how to book missions, he's going to be talking about how to use Slooh's telescopes and how to book missions, and all beautiful things like that. So it's 10 o'clock, perfect timing. And I'm really grateful to be here, and it's so lovely to share these stories. I hope you're as interested in Petrus Plancius' story as I was. It kind of blew me away, especially his connection to Henry Hudson. And as personally, I'm part Dutch, and I'm flat-footed, and I live in New York by the Hudson River. So I was like, wow, he's my kind of astronomer, obviously. And just remember, if you want to see a unicorn, don't go looking for a unicorn. And with that, I will leave you for this evening. Thank you very much. I really look forward to being here again next Sunday. So I wish you clear skies for the rest of the week, and I hope you get to see tons of stars. Good night.